Hello, my name is Jacob Bennett, and I'll be presenting on um, the historical significance and impact of the Catholic Church. So to begin with, I wanted to express that there are some that would say that the influence of the Church can be overestimated at times. While that may be true, the Protestant split and subsequent changes that occurred within the Catholic Church caused a wide array of events that can be linked to the Church itself. Um, they led to things like the Scientific Revolution, as well as the founding of America, which are two very impactful events through history. There's also things like the Humanist movement and the Age of Enlightenment that were a direct result of the Catholic Reformation. And this changed how people thought on a fundamental level. Imperial colonists took their new ways of thinking and spread them to other places, such as South America, Africa, North America as well. Quakers that were among some of the first settlers in America, especially during its independence, were very integral in moving towards freedom and racial equality. So we can see from just one point in history, a lot of events sort of exploded out from that and helped shape the modern world we see today. But we're going to go more in depth through this presentation and show just how much religion has influenced the modern world. Our first section is the Age of Change. So we start in 1517 CE when a member of the Catholic Church named Martin Luther was showing some concerns and really some disdain for the way that the church was being run. And as a result, he released a paper known as the 95 Theses. And by doing this, he laid out all of his major issues that he had with the church, namely pointing to its level of corruption and its unwillingness to help the people that it was supposed to serve. But in doing so, this was one of the biggest motivations to see the split of a large group of members away from the Catholic Church, in which they formed the Protestant group. During this time, we saw a Reformation occur wherein the Catholic Church took a look at its remaining members and saw that they couldn't continue on in the way they had been doing things, and it was time to work on making the people the forefront and giving them more autonomy and more power in their own salvation. And this led to basically a changing of ideals in which the people could have more freedom in the way that they worship, but also control over their own salvation rather than having to rely on the church to do so. So the European population began to awaken to this idea of a world that wasn't necessarily constricted by the Catholic agenda. And they could essentially make their own choices on how they would pursue their religion. And seeing this happen, seeing this sort of shift in ideas where you weren't necessarily having to follow the church's reign very strictly, the reform spurred on what is now known as the Renaissance, an age of enlightenment and an age where a lot of new ideas were starting to come to fruition. And also at the same time as this, we saw the introduction of one of the most important inventions of our time, which was the printing press. So books like the Bible, but also a lot of other texts that were initially extravagant and usually items that weren't owned by the more poor population, they became much more common as the printing press made it easier to obtain those books since they didn't need to be handwritten anymore. With this happening, the new ideals that were within the Renaissance became easier to spread. And one of these ideals was humanism. And to sort of break down what that is, humanism is this belief that human beings were able to take control and take pride of their own achievements, that they were, in fact, the center of their own universe. And instead of glorifying a deity or giving their hard work to the church, they were able to take their own responsibility for their actions. So this new way of thinking was essentially very contradictory to the Catholic beliefs, and it was sort of this rebellion of ideas away from the church and the way that it had limited people. Instead of being a part of this thing that made them feel small and insignificant, they were able to challenge us with this idea that their actions had impact on the world and they could make their own choices. But around this same time, we saw the scientific revolution also start to spring forth, and this age of scientific reason was also sparked by these ideas of the Catholic Reformation. We saw more people challenging their beliefs, challenging the church, what they thought to be true, and feeling more emboldened to go against what had been laid out before them in the past. And during this time, we saw individuals like Sir Francis Bacon, William Harvey, and even Sir Isaac Newton coming to the forefront and showing us that if we change our way of thinking to be more critical and more observant, we're able to better understand the nature of the world around us. And in doing so, we're able to further advance the fields of study like mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. Moving on from that age of change, we're getting into the Imperial Age where we start to see the spread of ideas, specifically the Christian belief, to other nations outside of Europe. So the Catholic Church itself has always been very active in its mission work. They send out members of the church to different countries for the sake of trying to convert people to Christianity. And this idea was always very enticing because it meant to change someone or to convert someone was to save a soul, which is always a benefit to Christians. In their own eyes, they were able to um, bring more people to God by their actions. So they sent people across the globe, essentially to places like Africa and Asia, as well as South America. But some might see this as an opportunity to open the door for the age of imperialism. Africa, for instance, in the 19th century, did become a focal point for a lot of these major European countries, and this was because it was full of rare resources and very valuable materials, things like gold and ivory, and unfortunately also human lives that were put up for the slave trade. So it was during this time that we saw the emergence of this ideology called the white man's burden, which is going to play heavily into the church and how it viewed itself. Essentially, this white man's burden was a justification for imperialism, but it started as this basic premise that people that were essentially not white were considered unfortunate or misguided, and they needed to be saved by more quote unquote advanced white members of the human race. And a major component of this belief was that these people that were outside of these European countries, these African individuals or South American, were essentially damned to hell in the views of the Catholic Church and the views of Europeans. These people, without their help, would be going to hell. So they thought that if we can go to these countries and we can spread Christianity, we'll actually be saving these people, we'll actually be saving their souls from damnation. And so while it's up in the air how much they actually believed in this method, it definitely was a very strong justification to get people behind the idea of moving in and taking control of other countries. Around this same time, though, imperialism, we see another group, we see the Protestants that we talked about earlier, start to come to the Americas. They start to land here. This is a little bit different than we saw with other imperialistic groups, and that's just because the Protestants were actually trying to set themselves aside from a larger group rather than spread the interests of the Catholic Church. Protestants were more so concerned about their own religious freedoms uh, and separating themselves from having to worship in a certain way. These early colonies were founded around um, this belief, and eventually this would lead to what we know as the American Revolution. Not necessarily the need for religious freedom specifically, but the need for freedom of expression and the need for freedom in general would lead to that revolution. So now we get into the founding of America and how the church played a role in that, moving away from necessarily the Catholic Church and into Protestant and Quaker influences. So in 1776, we start to see the makings of a new country come into place, into a new government, really. In Philadelphia, we see this colony specifically become a melting pot of a lot of different beliefs and a lot of different types of people, one of which were this Puritan group known as the Quakers. And they were a very strong proponent for personal rights. They strove against slavery for one, but also just they were more a advocate for having everyone be able to make their own choices, the idea of a free man that wasn't bound to their country, but rather their country was there to serve them. So while we can't say that there was direct influence from Protestants and from their church on the independence, there was definitely a lot of reasons why we went to war and why we fought for our independence. There is an easy line to draw just in having these sort of Quaker and Puritan beliefs in that climate in which people wanted to be free from oppressive rule. But at that point when we would actually gain our freedom from England and start to form our own government, our own way of doing things, we also found that we got to a point where we couldn't just stay within the confines of that eastern coast of North America. We had to find a way to spread out. And so in the early 1800s, this new government, this new country that had just been founded, had to find a way to expand. And this very similar to the Imperial Age, came with the idea that there was some sort of God-given right to expansion, and this was known as manifest destiny. So as that population started to grow, the U.S. began to buy up more land from France, and then started to make more aggressive moves like absorbing the Texas territory that was independent. We did that in 1845. And it was just widely accepted at this point that there was no reason why America shouldn't expand its border all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So with this happening, though, we saw that the people that were already present in America at this time were pushed aside, displaced, killed in some instances, in many instances, and also just subjugated to the destruction of their homes and their culture as the American people started to march forward into the West Coast. This is one of the more negative impacts of this mentality that some sort of religious or higher power gives people the right to do the things that they want to do, and being justified in their actions, they feel more emboldened to do things that would normally be considered heinous acts. But as we progress through the history of America, we see that we come to a point where these beliefs that had started this country started to uh, cause a split, cause a rift in how different Americans viewed the situation. We had these Quakers in the northern region, and their beliefs had persisted in the idea that people should be free and no human should own another. And it was this foundational belief that caused issue with prominent slave owners in the South. And we saw actually that the continued growth of the church, of specifically Puritan churches and really just Christian churches in general, saw that congregations started to mold and meld into multiracial groups. And so it wasn't long before there were large amounts of activists and abolitionists that were looking to free slaves. Ultimately, this would lead to the rise of the secession of the South and thus the Civil War after that, one of the largest conflicts in American history that happened on American soil. Moving on, though, in history from that point, we see that there's another effect of the church within recent history, and we actually look back towards the Catholic Church in this specific instance. But as we fast forward in time, we show that the presidency of 1960, where John F. Kennedy was elected, there actually was some influence by the Catholic Church. And the main thing that we saw here is that JFK himself was very charismatic, and he was able to win over some of those that were opposed to a Catholic president. A lot of these individuals were saying that that a president that was Catholic would be more inclined to serve Catholic interests than that of his own people, because obviously his religion or his own soul would come before his duty. But in being able to win over those individuals, it was very easy for JFK to clinch the victory after that, as he had 83% of the Catholic vote and approval by the Pope and things like that. So while JFK had openly stated that he was not being defined by his religion, it is kind of hard to argue the point that it may have played a very significant role in him winning that election. So this event is able to actually show how the church is still able to hold power over how people make decisions on a very basic level. And it's almost instinctual when the church says something, there are devout followers of that belief. They don't really question it, they just move in the way that the church asks them to. But yeah, we can see that with having this president elected, we saw a lot of huge changes take place in American history. The advancement into the Vietnam War started with JFK presidency. We also had events like the Bay of Pigs and the following trade embargo with Cuba, but also things like the first successful mission to the moon. Lots of big changes that occurred here because of the sway that the Catholic Church had over the vote. So as we look more here at some of the religious influence that has been shown today in modern America, the impact can be subtle, but we only have to look a little bit deeper to see how this country has been affected. Even if it's a bunch of very small influences that has been had on our country, it's very hard to deny the fact that an institution that's over 2,000 years older than our own country has had a very significant part in its founding, major events throughout its history, as well as where it stands currently. Some of these influences have been positive. Things that we look at now, like the Reformation of the church, humanism, and the scientific revolution, these are things that have borne great advancements in American history. So they lead to things like the Industrial Revolution. We see major technological advances as a result of these new ways of thinking and sort of bringing us out of the Dark Ages. But we also see influences that have been detrimental to many. And it's unfortunate, and sometimes we can overlook this because we, as if we're non-native or non-indigenous Americans, we don't really see a lot of these detrimental effects. But things like the uprooting of the indigenous people of the Americas was definitely driven by this idea that if you're not Christian, then you don't necessarily have the same rights that Christians do because your soul isn't being accepted the same way that Christians would be. And this was a justification to treat people heinously and with malice. We also saw this sort of mentality persist as well with the enslavement of individuals in Africa that were eventually ended up in America, leading to those conflicts and the need to be free, which still persists in many of our cultural understandings today. So I have a few closing thoughts here just to wrap everything up. So religion itself has both had indirect and direct influences on most of recorded human history, but in the span that we're looking at, it's been a double-edged blade that has been helpful to some and been very detrimental to others. The Catholic Church itself has been able to drive change by its own actions and things that it's been able to influence, but we've also seen that there's been this level of rebellion, sort of like a child trying to lash out against an oppressive parent. We've seen the Catholic Church drive rebellion and drive change through people trying to get away from the Catholic Church and people trying to challenge it and do things differently. But even today, we see issues and problems and influence caused by sort of religious influence. There's still issues with the respect for marginalized groups. So members of LGBTQ plus communities have long found that there's been resistance to their even existence by the church. Also, women have been another group oppressed by the church in having their own full autonomy over their bodies, and this has been a consistent issue, not just within the Catholic Church, but many branches of religion in just treating minority groups as less than. Lastly, the Christianity itself, in particular, has been definitely the most influential religion in the U.S., if not the world at large. And while we don't always see its direct influence over an event, its constant presence within ourselves, within voters, within politicians, within founders of this country, it makes it undeniable that almost every major point of American history has been shaped in some small or large way by religion and Christianity in specific. But this does conclude my presentation. I do appreciate you taking the time to view it. If there are any questions, please reach out and let me know.